the German machine gunner pressed himself against the frozen earth of his foxhole somewhere in the Ardennes forest. It was the morning of December 16th, 1944, and Obergefreiter Klaus Becker had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. He knew the rhythm of American artillery. First, the distant thump of guns. Then, seconds to find cover. Then the whistle overhead. Then the impacts, walking across the landscape in a predictable pattern, give you time to press deeper into the earth, to pray, to survive. But what happened next violated everything he knew about staying alive. There was no warning thump, no whistle building in crescendo. Just an instant, a single, impossible instant when the world became fire and steel. 12 shells arrived simultaneously, not one after another, not in a walking barrage, all at once, the same fraction of a second. Before he could process what was happening, the position he'd occupied moments before simply ceased to exist. The mathematical precision of it was almost beautiful, if beauty could kill. Becker survived because he'd been rotating to a secondary position. 37 men in his company did not. There had been no time to take cover because there had been no warning. The Americans had somehow taught physics itself a new trick, and the rules of artillery warfare rules that had governed battlefields since Napoleon had fundamentally changed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This is the story of how American gunners developed time-on-target fire missions, a tactical innovation so profound that German soldiers began calling American artillery the Whispering Death. It's a story about mathematics, desperation, and the strange way that warfare sometimes advances through the simple question, what if we stopped doing it the way we've always done it? To understand why time-on-target mattered, you need to understand what artillery was before 1943. For centuries, artillery worked on a simple principle. You fired guns in sequence, adjusted based on where the shells landed, and eventually saturated an area with enough explosives that you destroyed your target. The process was methodical, almost industrial. A forward observer would call coordinates. A fire direction center would calculate the data. Guns would fire. Observers would note where shells landed, long, short, left, right. Adjustments would be made. More shells would follow. This system had an inherent problem. It gave the enemy time to react. From the moment the first shell landed to the moment the barrage became truly effective, skilled troops could find cover. German infantry in particular had become extraordinarily adept at this survival calculus. They'd learned on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery would announce itself with ranging shots, giving Wehrmacht soldiers precious seconds to get their heads down. By 1943, German tactical doctrine treated Allied artillery as a manageable threat. Dangerous, certainly, deadly if you were caught in the open, but survivable if you knew the rhythm. The Americans who arrived in North Africa in late 1942 and Sicily in July of 1943 quickly discovered they were fighting an enemy who'd been at war for 4 years. The Wehrmacht had developed an almost supernatural ability to disappear when shells started falling, then reappear the moment the barrage lifted. American infantry would attack behind an artillery preparation, only to find German machine gun positions fully manned and operational. The textbook said a thorough artillery bombardment should suppress enemy positions. Reality said something different. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bull understood this problem intimately. As a fire support officer with the 3rd Infantry Division in Sicily, Bull had watched American attacks stall repeatedly because German defenders simply waited out the preliminary bombardments. It frustrated him with the particular intensity of someone who deals in mathematics and precision. Artillery wasn't failing because American gunners couldn't shoot accurately. It was failing because accuracy alone wasn't enough. The Germans had time, that precious commodity that let them survive. Bull began thinking about time itself as a tactical weapon. What if you could eliminate the warning? What if instead of shells arriving in sequence over several minutes, they all arrived in the same second? Not approximately the same second, the exact same second, down to the fraction. The psychological impact alone would be devastating, but more importantly, there would be no opportunity to take cover. You couldn't react to something that gave you zero warning. The concept was theoretically simple but practically complex. Different artillery batteries were positioned at different distances from a target. A battery 2,000 yards away and a battery 6,000 yards away couldn't fire simultaneously and have their shells land together. The physics didn't work that way. The father gun needed a head start. But how much of a head start? That required calculations more precise than anything typically done in field artillery. Bull started working through mathematics. Time of flight for a shell wasn't a simple equation. It varied based on charge, elevation, weather conditions, even the wear on the gun barrel, but it could be calculated. More importantly, it could be calculated in advance if you had the right tables and enough staff officers with sharp pencils and patience for trigonometry. What Bull was proposing was this: designate an exact time, say, 0900 hours and 30 seconds. Work backward from that moment, calculating precisely when each battery needed to fire so that all shells arrived at the target at that exact instant. He called it time on target. The name was deliberately simple, almost bland. It described exactly what it did without drama, but the implications were revolutionary. This wasn't just a new firing technique, it was a fundamental reimagining of how artillery worked as a weapon system. The first challenge was convincing anyone to try it. The artillery establishment in 1943 was conservative by nature, built on procedures refined over decades. Bull was proposing something that required far more calculation time, perfect coordination between batteries, and absolute synchronization of fire commands. Every battery had to execute their fire mission with split-second precision. There was no room for error. If one battery fired even 10 seconds early or late, the entire effect was compromised. But Bull had one advantage. The Italian campaign was providing a continuous education in what didn't work. By autumn of 1943, American forces were grinding their way up the Italian peninsula through some of the most defensible terrain in Europe. German forces were using every hill, every river, every stone farmhouse to maximum advantage. Standard artillery preparation was proving inadequate. Division commanders were receptive to anything that might break the stalemate. The first experimental time-on-target mission was fired in October of 1943 during the advance toward the Volturno River. 4 batteries, 16 guns total, were assigned coordinates on a German observation post. Fire direction centers worked backward from the designated impact time, calculating time of flight for each battery. The target time was set for precisely 1400 hours. The results were remarkable enough that observers initially thought they'd miscounted the number of shells. They hadn't. All 16 shells had landed in a 4-second window, close enough to create the effect Bull had predicted: a single, overwhelming burst of destruction, with no warning and no opportunity for reaction. The German observation post was eliminated so completely that American patrols later found it difficult to determine exactly where it had been. Word spread through artillery units with the velocity of something that actually worked. By December of 1943, time-on-target procedures were being distributed throughout the Fifth Army. Fire direction centers began keeping detailed tables of time-of-flight data. Radio procedures were standardized to ensure batteries received fire commands with enough advance notice to calculate their individual firing times. Mathematics became routine, still complex, but routine in the way that difficult things become manageable through practice. The Germans noticed something had changed sometime in early 1944, though they initially couldn't articulate what. German after-action reports from Italy began, including references to sudden artillery strikes and simultaneous fire. What they were experiencing violated their dominant understanding of how American artillery operated. Americans were supposed to telegraph their punches. They were supposed to fire ranging shots, make adjustments, then bring the full weight of their guns to bear gradually. This was different. This arrived all at once, with no warning rhythm to key on. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June of 1944, time on target was standard procedure for US artillery units. The invasion plan incorporated it from the beginning. During the breakout from the hedgerows in late July, Operation Cobra time on target missions were used to devastating effect against German positions. The concentrated bursts of fire created gaps in German lines that American armor could exploit before defenders could reoccupy positions. The technical reality of time on target was more demanding than it appeared. Fire direction centers became mathematical workshops, calculating problems that required absolute precision under combat conditions. Each gun had its own ballistic personality. Barrel wear affected muzzle velocity, temperature affected propellant burn rate, humidity changed air resistance. What worked for Battery A at 2,000 yards didn't work for Battery C at 5,000 yards. The solution came through obsessive documentation. Artillery units began maintaining detailed firing tables that accounted for every variable. How many rounds had each gun fired? What was the current barrel wear? What was the ambient temperature? What charge was being used? Each fire mission required staff officers to work backward from the target time, factoring in all these variables to determine when each gun needed to fire. The process looked something like this. A forward observer identified a target and requested a time-on-target mission for 09:15 hours exactly. The Fire Direction Center would plot the target coordinates and determine which batteries could effectively engage it. Let's say Battery A was 3,000 yards from the target, Battery B was 4,500 yards, and Battery C was 6,000 yards. Using their firing tables, they'd calculate time of flight for each battery. Battery C's shells would take approximately 28 seconds to reach the target. Battery B's shells would take approximately 22 seconds. Battery A's shells would take approximately 18 seconds. Working backward from 09:15 hours, Battery C would need to fire at 09:14 hours and 32 seconds. Battery B would fire at 09:14 hours and 38 seconds. Battery A would fire at 09:14 hours and 42 seconds. The Fire Direction Center would transmit these specific firing times to each battery. At their designated moment, each battery would fire. 28 seconds later, at precisely 09:15 hours, all shells would impact the target simultaneously. This required communications infrastructure that didn't exist in most armies. The US military's investment in radio equipment and trained radio operators became essential. Each battery needed reliable communication with the Fire Direction Center. Time synchronization had to be absolute. Artillery units began using synchronized watches, checking them obsessively against radio time signals. The margin for error was measured in seconds. German forces trying to understand what was happening faced a conceptual problem. Their artillery doctrine, inherited from the First World War and refined through the interwar period, treated artillery as a weapon of attrition. You massed guns, you fired methodically, you adjusted, you achieved saturation. The idea of coordinating multiple batteries to achieve simultaneous impact seemed unnecessarily complicated. Why go through such elaborate calculations when you could simply fire more shells? The answer became clear in combat, because simultaneous impact changed the fundamental equation of survival. German infantry training emphasized artillery discipline at the first sign of incoming fire. Get down, get covered, wait for the barrage to pass. This worked against sequential fire. It didn't work against time on target because there was no first sign. The shells were simply there, all at once, transforming a specific point on the map into concentrated destruction before any human nervous system could react. The psychological effect was more damaging than the physical effect, though the physical effect was considerable. German soldiers interviewed after the war frequently mentioned American artillery as uniquely terrifying, not because it was more numerous than Soviet artillery, but because it was unpredictable. Soviet artillery announced itself. American artillery increasingly did not. You could be in a foxhole, scanning the horizon, hearing nothing, and then the world would explode around you with no intervening warning. The stress of that uncertainty, maintained over weeks of combat, was extraordinarily corrosive to morale. By the Ardennes offensive in December of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge time on target had become standard practice for American artillery units. The German attack initially caught American forces off balance, but as US forces recovered and counterattacked, artillery played a decisive role. Time-on-target missions were used to interdict German supply routes, destroy assembly areas, and most effectively, to break up German armoured concentrations before they could coordinate their attacks. One incident from late December illustrates the tactical impact. The 2nd Armoured Division was facing elements of the 2nd Panzer Division near Celles, Belgium. German tanks were assembling for a coordinated push, using a tree line for concealment. American observers identified the position and called for a time-on-target mission involving 8 batteries, 32 guns. The target time was set for 1400 hours. At precisely 1400 hours, 32 high-explosive shells impacted a 200-yard stretch of tree line simultaneously. The concentration was devastating. German tanks that had been moving into position were caught in the open. The crews that survived the initial barrage described it as incomprehensible. One moment they were maneuvering. The next moment the world was fire and shrapnel, with no gradual build-up, no warning, crescendo. Several tanks were destroyed outright, others were damaged. More importantly, the coordination required for their planned attack was shattered. The psychological shock of the sudden barrage scattered the formation. The mathematics behind time on target also enabled something called massed time on target, where even more batteries could be coordinated for priority targets. During critical moments in the Ardennes fighting, Fire Direction Centers coordinated missions involving 12 or more batteries, 48 guns or more, all timing their fire. So shells arrived in the same few seconds. The amount of calculation required was staggering. Each gun needed its individual firing time calculated and transmitted. Each battery commander needed to ensure their guns fired at the precise moment specified. The margin for error across all these moving parts was minimal, yet American artillery units pulled it off consistently. This wasn't luck or occasional success, this was systematic, repeatable capability. Fire Direction Centers became extremely proficient at the calculations. Radio discipline was maintained even under stress. Gun crews learned to execute time-sensitive fire commands with precision. The institutional knowledge spread through the artillery branches rapidly because it worked, and soldiers are remarkably quick to adopt techniques that keep them alive and kill the enemy effectively. German artillery, by contrast, never developed comparable capability. This wasn't because German gunners were less skilled. German artillery was quite effective throughout the war. But the German military system in 1944 and 1945 was under such strain that implementing something as administratively complex as time on target was beyond their capacity. It required dedicated training time, investment in communication infrastructure, and most critically, the stable rear area infrastructure to develop and distribute the detailed firing tables the system required. Germany, in the final years of the war, had none of these things. The tactical implications extended beyond the immediate destruction of targets. Time on target changed how German forces could operate. Concentrating troops or vehicles became more dangerous because American artillery could now achieve surprise. The traditional warning signs, the sound of distant guns, the whistle of approaching shells were gone. German commanders had to assume that any position, at any moment, could be struck without warning. This forced dispersion, which made coordination more difficult, which degraded combat effectiveness. American infantry noticed the change quickly. They'd watched attacks stall in Italy when German machine gun positions survived preliminary bombardments. Now, when artillery was called in before an assault, German positions frequently remained silent after the barrage. Not because they'd been obliterated, though sometimes they had been, but because the shock effect of simultaneous impact left defenders disoriented, even if they'd survived physically. The psychological disruption bought American infantry those critical first minutes of an assault when defenders were most vulnerable. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The spring of 1945 brought the final campaigns in Europe, and time on target was by then so thoroughly integrated into American artillery doctrine that it was unremarkable simply the way things were done. During the crossing of the Rhine in March, artillery preparation relied heavily on time-on-target missions to suppress German positions on the eastern bank. The simultaneous impact of multiple batteries created windows of opportunity for assault boats to cross without facing coordinated fire. One fire direction officer later described the work as similar to conducting an orchestra, if orchestras dealt in high explosives and split-second timing rather than music. Each battery was an instrument, each gun a voice, and the conductor's job was ensuring they all spoke at precisely the right moment to create a single, overwhelming chord of destruction. The metaphor captured something important about how time on target required thinking about artillery as a system rather than as individual guns. The development of time on target represented something broader about how the American military approached warfare. Where other armies might have accepted the limitations of existing artillery doctrine, sequential fire is how it's done, dispersion and ranging shots are necessary, simultaneous impact is theoretically nice but practically impossible, American officers asked, why? What if we did the math? What if we invested the time and training to make the impossible routine? This willingness to question established practice, to experiment with new techniques even when they seemed overly complicated, gave American forces tactical advantages that accumulated across hundreds of engagements. Time on target didn't win the war by itself. No single tactical innovation does. But it contributed to the larger pattern where American forces could concentrate combat power more effectively, more efficiently, and more unpredictably than their opponents. The Germans called American artillery whispering death, not because it was silent, artillery is never silent, but because it increasingly arrived without warning. The whisper they referenced was psychological, the constant, gnawing fear that at any moment, with no indication, the earth could erupt around you. That fear degraded combat effectiveness in ways that pure firepower alone couldn't achieve. After the war ended in May of 1945, time on target remained standard artillery doctrine. It was used in Korea, refined further in Vietnam, and continues in modified form with modern artillery systems. The principle hasn't changed. Coordinate fire from multiple positions so that all rounds impact simultaneously, eliminating warning and maximizing both physical and psychological effect. Modern computers have made the calculations easier, but the underlying mathematics are the same ones Harold Bull worked through in Sicily in 1943. Klaus Becker, the German machine gunner from the opening of this story, survived the war. He was captured during the Ardennes fighting and spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner camp in Belgium. In interviews conducted decades later, he described American artillery as the most frightening thing he'd experienced in 6 years of combat. Not the most destructive, that distinction went to Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front, which achieved saturation through sheer volume of fire, but the most psychologically disturbing because it gave him no pattern to learn, no rhythm to anticipate. Soviet artillery, he said, was like weather, you could see it coming and take shelter. American artillery was like lightning, sudden, specific, and impossible to predict. The innovation of time on target illustrates how warfare evolves not just through new weapons, but through new ways of using existing weapons. American artillery in 1943 used the same basic guns as artillery in 1918. The shells were somewhat improved, but fundamentally similar. What changed was the thinking, the recognition that time itself could be weaponized, that mathematics could transform effectiveness, that coordination could achieve effects, that raw firepower alone could not. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Bull never became a household name. There are no monuments to time on target, no dramatic Hollywood depictions of fire direction centers doing trigonometry under deadline pressure. But the tactical innovation he developed saved American lives, killed enemy soldiers more efficiently, and demonstrated that sometimes the most effective weapon is simply a better idea about how to use what you already have. The detailed firing tables developed for time on target filled binders that artillery units maintained obsessively. These tables represented thousands of hours of calculation, testing, and refinement. They accounted for every conceivable variable: temperature, humidity, altitude, barrel wear, propellant lot numbers, projectile weight variations. The institutional commitment to making time on target work revealed something about the American approach to warfare, a willingness to invest enormous effort in administrative preparation to achieve tactical advantage. German officers analyzing American tactics after the war often expressed grudging respect for this approach. The Wehrmacht prided itself on tactical flexibility and initiative, on officers making rapid decisions in fluid situations. But the Americans, they noted, had a different kind of efficiency, the efficiency of systematic preparation, of anticipating problems and solving them in advance through meticulous calculation. Time on target exemplified this perfectly. Solve the mathematics once, distribute the tables, train the procedure, and then execute it repeatedly in combat with mechanical precision. The impact on artillery organization was lasting. Fire direction centers became more elaborate, requiring additional trained personnel. Artillery units invested heavily in communications equipment because time on target was only possible if all batteries could receive synchronized fire commands. Training time increased as gun crews learned to execute time-sensitive missions where a 10-second delay could compromise the entire effect. The artillery branch became more technical, more dependent on mathematics and coordination, less about individual gun crews and more about integrated fire systems. This evolution continued through the decades that followed. By the Korean War, time on target was supplemented by proximity-fused shells, which multiplied effectiveness by detonating above ground rather than on impact. By Vietnam, computers began assisting with the calculations, making even more complex missions practical. Modern artillery can coordinate fire from guns, rockets, and aircraft to achieve effects that would have seemed impossible in 1943. But the principle remains: concentrate fire in time as well as space, eliminate warning, maximize shock. The human element remained central. All the firing tables and synchronized watches meant nothing if gun crews couldn't execute under pressure. Time on target required discipline, firing at the specified moment, even when instinct said to fire now to engage the target you could see. It required trust in the system, belief that the calculations were correct, faith that other batteries would also fire at their designated times. This kind of systematic coordination doesn't happen automatically. It requires training, leadership, and the accumulated experience of soldiers who learn to trust their procedures because those procedures consistently work. The Germans never developed equivalent capability, partly because they never had the breathing space to do so. Time on target required stable rear areas where firing tables could be developed, where gun crews could train on time-sensitive missions, and where radio networks could be established and maintained. By 1943, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts, under constant pressure, with dwindling resources. Implementing something administratively complex was beyond their capacity, even if they'd recognized the value. This points to a larger reality about tactical innovation. The best idea means nothing if you can't implement it. Time on target required not just mathematical insight, but the entire institutional infrastructure to make it work. Trained personnel, communication systems, time for practice, the administrative capacity to develop and distribute procedures. American forces had this infrastructure. German forces, by the latter stages of the war, increasingly did not. The specific mathematics of time on target weren't particularly complicated by professional artillery standards. Any competent fire direction officer could learn the calculations. What was complicated was doing those calculations rapidly under combat conditions, coordinating multiple batteries across distances, maintaining time synchronization, and executing the fire missions with split-second precision. Simple concepts often prove difficult in practice. Time on target succeeded because American artillery units invested the effort to make difficult things routine. Individual stories from the campaign illustrate how time on target changed ground combat. Infantry officers who'd experienced combat in North Africa or Sicily before time on target became standard could articulate the difference clearly. Before, you called for artillery and waited first for the guns to respond, then for ranging shots, then for the barrage to build. You had time to reconsider, to adjust, to coordinate with the shifting situation. After, you called for artillery at a specific time, and at that exact moment, the target area erupted. The immediacy changed how infantry could maneuver, enabling attacks that would have been impractical with slower, more gradual artillery support. The legacy of time on target extends beyond artillery doctrine. It represented a broader American strength, the ability to identify problems, apply systematic thinking, and invest the effort to make solutions work at scale. This wasn't about individual brilliance, though Harold Bull was clearly talented. It was about institutional willingness to change, to experiment, to adopt better methods, even when they required more work. That organizational characteristic served American forces well throughout the war and continues to influence military thinking today. When we think about military innovation, we often imagine dramatic breakthroughs, new weapons, revolutionary technologies, battlefield genius. Time on target was none of these things. It was simply mathematics, discipline, and coordination. But it killed German soldiers efficiently, supported American infantry effectively, and demonstrated that sometimes the most profound innovations are the least glamorous. No breakthrough in metallurgy, no revolutionary propellant, no wonder weapon. Just the insight that if you do the math carefully enough, you can make all the shells arrive at the same time, and that simple change transforms artillery from a weapon the enemy can anticipate into a weapon that arrives without warning. The German machine gunner who learned to fear American artillery wasn't responding to American numerical superiority, though American forces did eventually achieve overwhelming material advantage. He was responding to the unpredictability, the elimination of the warning patterns he'd learned to survive by. Time on target weaponized uncertainty itself. And uncertainty, maintained over weeks and months of combat, erodes soldiers in ways that raw firepower alone cannot achieve. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.